Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Breakout Chapel. I am excited to have y'all with us again this week. As you know, we are going through Micah 6:8. We are spending the whole semester talking about one verse, which is not a way to bore you. It's a way to show you that there is more meaning and more depth and more exploration to be done in any one verse of Scripture than you will accomplish in a semester. At least I hope that's the message you got, and not, wow, he really didn't have any better ideas this semester. We really thought that 2020 was a good time to talk about he has shown you, oh man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to walk to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. That felt like a really good thing, especially as we were planning this coming off of the summer of 2020. Man, did that feel like something we should spend some time talking about. So you are here in narrative, faith and narrative arts, our breakout. I assume you're here on purpose. You didn't stumble into this Zoom session accidentally. And I am really excited to get to shift you into another art form and introduce you to another friend. And I want you guys to meet my friend Shigé Clark. She is here with us. She is a poet. She is a friend and member of the Rabbit Room, which is a group that you have heard me talk about many times. And if you hadn't, you haven't been paying attention. Pay attention. I talk about it a lot. So she is part of that band of friends who are connected with us. And she is going to help us talk about the third concept in Micah 6:8 that we haven't gotten to yet, humility. So we talked about justice and Christopher Fry's play, The Lady's Not for Burning, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We talked about mercy with my friend Justin Jones and Dumbledore and the Pensive, with nice little rabbit trails into Norse mythology. And now we're going to talk with my friend Shigé about a poem that she is going to help introduce us to and see where the concept of humility, walking humbly with God, is embodied in art. Shigé, can you do a good job of introducing yourself and saying hello to our friends?
Well, I guess that's for you to decide whether I do a good job.
I'll judge you at the end of it.
I can give it a go.
Yep.
Well, as Scott said, Scott, thanks so much for having me here. My name is Shigé. I do work at the Rabbit Room. I spent some time before that in the military and have been all over the place doing lots of different things, but I'm glad to be here talking about poetry right now more than anything else. That's the joy of my heart. So yeah, I don't know what else to say beyond what you said. I have always poetry. I was just talking to Scott about how I think that poetry is more inexorable and linked. We were talking about how it's linked into life, it's linked into the Bible, and is more of a meat and potatoes thing in the meal of life than people treat it as. And I think the same thing for the concept of being a warrior poet. People today consider being in the military and being a poet as kind of strangely unsymmetrical, but the idea, I think that's a new idea, whereas before that used to be something that was more understood and expected from people back in the time of Tolkien and poets that wrote a lot from those experiences. So I'm excited to be here talking with you guys, and I love this poem, so excited to talk about the concept of humility.
Yeah, it is bizarre to me how central King David is to the narrative of our faith, and how we could still treat the idea of being a warrior poet, a royal artist, as being dichotomous, as being something that is weird or tough to get your mind wrapped around. Come on, people. Most of the Bible is poetry. This is not a weird thing that we are doing here. It is weird that you don't automatically think that this makes sense. And I'm not putting that on you. Some of you know that this makes sense, but if you're like, oh, this is weird, but then read your Bible. Read your Bible. It's mostly poetry. Okay, so why don't you tell us about the poem that you selected? Because I was very typically scattered, and I yanked your chain a number of times. I was like, hey, you got a poem that's about justice? Kidding. How about mercy? Kidding. Let's talk about humility. And you finally came up with an incredible poem to share with us. You want to introduce it?
Absolutely. So I don't mind at all that you yanked my chain around a little bit with different things. Like I said, it just gave me an opportunity to think about different themes in the poetry that I love. So never going to complain about that. But when we finally settled on humility, this was weirdly the first thing that came to mind. And because it's a spoken word poem and it has music behind it, I kind of dismissed it because I figured that you'd want, and I've learned better since, but I figured that you'd want something that was more, straight traditional poetry. And I wanted to be within the realm of that. So I looked at different things. I found, like you said, a poem by Donne that I thought was really perfect, and I still think that for the theme. I'd love to talk about that in connection with this poem, but that's for supper time. And I thought about some Mary Oliver poems that I think would be really great to represent humility in poetry, but I just couldn't get over this one. And eventually, it stuck so strongly that I came back and asked, hey, would this one work? And you were totally amenable and excited to do that. And I'm very glad.
Yes, that's a very polite way of saying I freaked out at what a great idea it was. And yeah, I did. There were a lot of exclamation points.
Well, I love that you're approaching this from a concept of finding the intersection and the overlap between different artistic styles, and not trying to stay just in, we have poetry, we have music, we have story, as though those don't interplay with each other in a really powerful way. So I love that.
This is what I tell you students all the time. Art is a phenomenological thing. It is not an ontological thing. It is not something that you categorize. It is something that happens. It is not something that you identify. It is something that you experience. And when you're talking about phenomenology instead of about definitions and boundaries and ontology, then the ways that we kind of cut things up and say, no, this is that kind of thing, it doesn't make sense anymore. And the poem that you've chosen is a terrific example of that. Tell us what it is, and then I'm going to show it and listen to it, and then we'll talk about it on the other end.
Okay. It is a poem called Precious Puritans, and it's by the poet Propaganda. And that's what it is.
Okay. I'm going to share this one with us. This is a kick in the teeth, wonderful poem. Let me share my computer sound. I may edit all of this out. We'll just get to all right. So let's share. All right. And Shigé, if you have any trouble hearing this or something doesn't look right, tell me and I'll fix it, and we'll get a good clean run at this. All right, here we go.
If you would allow me a second to deal with some in-house issues here. Hey, Pastor, it's hard for me when you quote Puritans. Oh, the precious Puritans. Have you not noticed our facial expressions? One of bewilderment and heartbreak, like not you two, Pastor. They were chaplains on slave ships, right? Would you quote Columbus to Cherokees? Would you quote Cortez to Aztecs, even if their theology was good? It just sings of blind privilege, wouldn't you agree? Your precious Puritans. They looked my onyx and bronze-skinned forefathers in their face. Their polytheistic, God-hating face. Their shackled, diseased, imprisoned face. And taught a gospel that said that God had multiple images in mind when he created us in it. Therefore, destined salvation contains a contentment in the stage for which they were given, which is to be owned by your forefathers' superior image-bearing face, says your precious Puritans. And my anger towards this teaching screams of an immature doctrine and a misunderstanding of the gospel. I should be content in this stage, right? Isn't that what Paul taught? According to your precious Puritans. Oh, you get it, but you don't get it. Oh, that we can go back to an America that once were founded on Christian values. They don't build preachers like they used to. Oh, the richness of their revelation. It must be nice to not have to consider race. It must be nice to have time to contemplate the stars. Pastor, your colorless rhetoric is a cop-out. You see my skin, and I see yours. And they are beautiful, fearfully and wonderfully, divinely designed. Uniqueness. Shouldn't we celebrate that rather than act like it ain't there? I get it. Your Puritans got it. But how come the things the Holy Spirit showed them in the valley of vision didn't compel them to knock on their neighbor's door and say, you can't own people? Your precious Puritans were not perfect. You romanticized them as if they were inerrant, as if the skeletons in their closet was barred and due to their hard work and tobacco growth, as if abolitionists were not racist and just pro-union, as if God only spoke to white boys with epic beards. You know, Jesus didn't really look like them paintings. That was just Michelangelo's boyfriend. Your precious Puritans. Oh, they got it, but they don't get it. There's not one generation of believers that has figured out the marriage between proper doctrine and action. Don't pedestal these people. Your precious Puritans, partners, purchased people. Why would you quote them? Step away. Think of the congregation that quotes you. Are you inerrant? Trust me, I know the feeling. Same feeling I get when people quote me like if they only knew. See, I get it, but I don't get it. Ask my wife. And it bothers me when you quote Puritans, if I'm honest. For the same reason it bothers me when people quote me they precious propaganda. So I guess it's true that God really does use crooked sticks to make straight lines, just like your precious Puritans.
Whew. Okay.
Yep.
So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that is not what the students were expecting that we were going to bring. So you sent this to me a couple weeks ago, and I listened to it, and I was super into it from the get-go. But I was in full bore like chapel planning mode, and I was like, okay, humility. Where's the when are we and then it comes in and kicks you in the teeth, and I was like, oh yes, this is an amazing choice for us to talk about. So where do you think what is the journey that Prop's going on here to arrive to humility?
So real quick, I want to say, because I had the same experience that you did over on this side, because originally I looked at this song when I still thought that I was going to be talking about justice. And it, like I said, it got stuck in my head when we had decided we were going to talk about humility, because in coming back and listening to it, I realized that's really what this entire poem is about. The whole poem.
Yeah.
And it seems like it gets to the end and suddenly it's about humility. But I think like any great poem, reaching the end of it requires that you go back and reread it.
Yes.
And see it in a completely new light. And when you do that, having reached that last quarter, and going back and reading it again or listening to it again, you realize that the entire story of the poem is about humility. So as I see it, like amidst all of the glorious internal rhymes and the phenomenal alliteration that's going on, I think that the true, standout hero of this poem, symmetry that is expressed throughout, that he uses to cause reflection. So the way I see the story of this poem is in almost a symmetrical picture of what he's calling for humility in someone else. First in their idols, in the way that they look at their idols, right. And then in the way that they look at themselves, right. And then reflecting that same humility back in a symmetrical pattern of having humility about himself, and then having humility about himself as an idol. And when I say that, what I mean is like he's challenging the pastor that he's talking to toward humility, challenging him toward humility about the people that he looks up to, and then about himself. And then he's challenging himself to have humility, and then also challenging his own listeners to have humility about him as someone that they look up to, in the same way that he called the pastor to about his idols at the beginning of the thing. So that symmetry is so powerful. And when you get to the end and he calls to you, the listener, who you can assume is a fan and someone who you know is used to going yes, you know, is going yes the entire time. Yeah. To have toward that same internal and external humility, that makes you go back and listen to the first part of it completely differently when you listen to it all over again. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes complete sense. And it took me a little while of thinking about it to stop saying that it was a poem about humility so much as the poem itself is an exercise of humility, an embodiment of humility.
Yeah.
So Micah 6:8, the verse that we're talking about here is this is the last bit of it. This is justice, mercy, and humility, which are really three different ways of talking about love, of course. And walk humbly with your God. When you hear that phrase, walk humbly with your God, anyone who has spent time in their Bible should immediately recall Adam and Eve walking with God in the garden, Moses being said to have walked with God, David being said to have walked with God. That's a fairly common expression to talk about being in relationship with God, right? You don't sit with God, you don't lie with God, you walk with God. It's an active way of describing the relationship. And the relationship is the way that humility gets brought in. Of course, the prophet is saying, love, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God, after saying, God is not into your noisy, showy displays of worship. Mm-hmm. God is not into your super spreader worship tours that draw attention to the person on stage and not to God. God is not asking that for worship. Noise doesn't get it done. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly. That's the acceptable worship. That's the acceptable sacrifice. And the walk humbly with your God, the humbly is about relationships, right? The humbly, to walk humbly is to acknowledge what again, the students should really be sick of me saying this one, to remember Kierkegaard's phrase, the infinite qualitative distinction, that God is not simply a bigger, better kind of human, that God is something different altogether. And we are not going to get better and better until we're God. That's not Christianity. But that God had to become something completely different, had to become one of us incarnate to bridge that distinction, that gap between us. And humility is recognizing that we are not God, that we are not going to be God, and that God is God. Mm-hmm. When we acknowledge that, when we know that, then we can walk humbly. So Prop has, again, it's what you said, that the poem becomes a circle. You get to the end of it and immediately have to go back to the beginning of it and experience it again. It forces you into that starting over, that journey again. But what are can you name all of the relationships that he enumerates in there that require sort of putting them in proper context about who you are and who God is, that leads to humility?
I think yes, that I can speak to that, because I see this poem as a whole, to connect to what you're saying, as a poetic representation of Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, right? So, and he drives that through, when I was talking about reflection and symmetry, through the repetition, through thematic repetition of a specific line. And that line is a few different forms of you, they, we get it, but don't get it, right? He says, you get it, but don't get it. They got it, but don't get it. I get it, but don't get it. And he repeats that at strategic intervals through the poem. First, again, talking about the idol. Well, he's talking to the pastor about himself, talking about the pastor's idols, the people that he looks up to and that represent, good theology to him, and that he sees as, this better paragon of Christianity, in a different day. And then talking about himself, and then bringing the entire Christian body into it. We get it, but we don't get it, right? So that thematic repeated line embodies the concept of humility, which is to say, I'm trying to speak to this in the most succinct way that I can, that humility, I think that this is such a glorious way of representing this, is not just being down on yourself, right? Like that, too many people, that's what they associate humility with. It's just, oh, I am worm. And that's neither how God sees us, nor how we should see ourselves. That's where we get into a false sense of humility, where we pretend, like the Pharisees saying, oh God, I'm so grateful that I'm not like this, this other person over here. But true humility is about holding our validity and our fallenness in the same hand, and being willing to give credence to both those things. And that's what Prop does in this, through the entire poem, both for the people that he's calling out, and when he calls out himself, and then when he calls us out as a Christian body. You see it from the beginning when he says, even if their theology was good. So from the beginning, he's giving credence to the fact that these Puritans, he's not wholly condemning them. He's calling out all the things that they did wrong, and yet still saying their theology was good. They had good theology. They get it, they got it, but they don't get it. He does that same reflection and symmetry in the line where he's describing his ancestors and says their polytheistic, God-hating face, and then immediately follows that up with their shackled, diseased, imprisoned face. That they're both at the same time. They were both wrong and victimized and right and wronged, right? In the same hand. So that repeated thematic line of we get it, but we don't get it, is where true humility lies, and that he's pulling out in all these different examples for both the people that we look at to as our representative of what is right, and for ourselves, saying that we at once know truth and are valid and valuable to God, and we have to admit that in order for it to be true humility. But also we have all simultaneously fallen so short, and real humility is holding those both in hand. And like you're saying it's God that is God, and all of us have fallen equally short, and all of us have a piece of it that that the others don't have. And being willing to admit that for yourself and for others is where true humility is.
Yeah, I think you are really sharp to draw in that parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, which is it's one of my favorite parables. I think it's one of Jesus' most sharp parables, because it invites you to engage with it and realize that, oh, the Pharisee is in the wrong for saying, thank God I'm not like, but as soon as you have that realization, you're in the wrong in that parable. as soon as you have that sense of superiority over the Pharisee, you've gotten flipped inside the parable and you're on the wrong side of it because wrong and wronged, because get it, don't get it is a constant state of being for a limited creation, for a limited creature who is not, who will not be an all-knowing God.
Come on now.
And I love his line at the end because it challenged the way that I was sort of picturing some of the imagery, that God uses crooked sticks to draw straight lines. Because I'm sure there are psychiatrists who would have fun with figuring out why my brain did what it did, but the imagery that I would have wanted with the curved stick would have been musing about the ways that God would straighten the curved stick, that God would smooth out the imperfections. But that's not where he goes, and I think he's right to not go there, to say, no, the crooked sticks aren't going to get straightened, but they can be used in the master's hand to draw straight lines. It is baffling and infuriating and mysterious why God has decided to use human beings to accomplish his will on earth. But he has. And, it's as we'll be watching this, it is election season. And there is no, if God couldn't work with mixed motives, God wouldn't have anything to work with. If God couldn't work with imperfect instruments, God wouldn't have anything to work with. And we seem to encounter that, and we get it but don't get it all the time, in these cycles. But man, is it a wonderful idea to think about, rather than needing to have God straighten out our bent sticks, our crooked sticks, that he can still use us for his purposes.
Amen.
That's some humility.
Absolutely. And I think that the extension of that, like true humility, as you're saying, is recognizing that for ourselves and for each other. Because what we tend to do is to say, I am a straight stick, and I'm in the right, and I know the right things. And these other people who don't believe the things that I believe theologically or in action or whatever, they are crooked sticks and will draw crooked lines. And humility is about recognizing I'm a crooked stick. Just because God can draw straight lines with me does not mean that I'm not a crooked stick.
Yep.
And with others, that God is using them to draw straight lines.
Yeah.
So we see others' crookedness and tend to ignore our own because we see how God is using us or has used the people that we admire. I think that's even more powerful. It's easier for us a lot of times to speak to our own crookedness than the crookedness of people that we admire, our pastors, our politicians, the people that we don't want to admit are broken and fall short of who God is and what his purposes accomplished. But being willing to admit, just because I see straight lines being drawn by this person doesn't mean that they weren't crooked, and vice versa. Just because I see the crookedness of this other person doesn't mean God's not using them to draw straight lines. I think that is the tension in which, we find true humility, rather than only seeing one side or the other. I think you've really hit it on the head.
I think it's also, he talks about the ways that you can have your theology lined up, you can have your doctrine lined up. It is possible for a straight stick to draw crooked lines as well in the wrong hands. And the big discussion that I saw, and my Twitter, niche that I tend to hang out is weird Christian Twitter. They're my people. But I'm in other little sort of pockets of the Twitterverse, and there was a lot of time spent this past summer talking about the harm that is done in quoting these Puritans over and over and over, in the harm that is done in using good doctrine to harm other people. What I say to the students, and I can already see myself editing this part out. Well, what am I going to do? is when I talk about how much more important faithfulness is to God than authenticity, which is what we love to make an idol of, because sometimes authentic Scott's an asshole, and that's not particularly helpful. It doesn't do me any good to be an asshole for Jesus. He doesn't need that. But faithfulness is always part of the call. Gosh, I loved that one. Now, for a little bit of bonus content here, you had also mentioned a poem by John Donne that you had thought about that actually ties in here some also. And my students are familiar enough to know that it's not a stretch to imagine me receiving beatings in high school. And I definitely took some abuse for coercing my senior year English teacher to spend more time on Shakespeare and Donne before moving on to other things. It turns out my classmates weren't as into that as I was, but I was so excited and loud that I got like an extra month of Shakespeare and Donne added to our coursework, and they weren't excited about that, and I don't understand why.
Oh.
John Donne and Shakespeare, who wouldn't be? Yeah.
Oh, I feel you so much on this.
But you mentioned a poem that I immediately freaked out about. Do you have it with you? I think I have it with me.
I do. I have it right
here. Which is the John Donne poem? It's one of his best known. One of his, it's the Holy Elegy. What number is it?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know which number. Are we talking about Batter My Heart, Three Persian God?
Yep, Batter My Heart.
Yeah. I'm not sure which number it is.
Okay. Well, why don't you, I would love to have you read this one for us, and then we can talk about it on the other side, because I'd love to have you read it. Could you do that?
I will try, but I'll probably mess it up. Just throwing that out. Yay. Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet, but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, or throw me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like a usurped town to another due, labor to admit you, but owe to no end, reason your viceroy and me should defend, but is captive, and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I except you enthrall me. Never shall we free, nor ever chase, except you ravish me.
Woo-hoo. So John Donne, for those of you who didn't get to study too much of him in high school, I feel very sorry for you. John Donne spent the first part of his life writing amazing dirty poetry and like overtly sexual poetry. I mean, all of his famous poems from his youth are seduction poems and everything. And in the middle of his life, he has a conversion experience, and he becomes I think he was ordained in the Anglican church, and he goes on to write an enduring collection of elegies and sonnets and meditations, letters and sermons that we have collected. And it is just he pours his visceral attraction to carnal human life, to passion and sexuality into his understanding of his relationship with God and God's relationship with his people. And it has the same earthy, embodied character to it in talking about holy things that I think we are a little bit too used to being treated very delicately, as if they don't have bodies, as if they, as if the things of God are spiritual and floaty and aren't made of meat. And Donne is always a good sort of punch of a reminder. He packs a wallop. And in this one, he's expressing the thing that I think we have all felt, the desire to do the things of God, to want the things of God, to be the things of God, and the inability to follow through with it, the inability to have his will be captured where his imagination has gone, where he knows his duty lies. What brought that poem to mind for you to talk about humility?
Well, this is actually, when we were talking about humility, the first poem that came to mind, and partially it was because it was fresh on my brain. Andrew had brought it, Andrew Peterson, president of the Rabbit Room, to staff meeting and read it. We were doing a thing where we read a poem at the beginning of each staff meeting, and this is one he read, so it was freshly on my mind. But I think had you brought me the topic of humility at any point, that this would have been one to come to mind, because it represents that aspect of humility that we were talking about before, that more self-deprecating sort of angle on it, like just a true depth of the recognition of the brokenness of self, to the point where to be able to say, and I think this is what people relate to in it, and why it's one of his better known ones, is like, we all know, whether to varying, conscious degrees, that we are so broken, and this poem speaks to a level of brokenness that says, I'm so broken, I can't of my own will do what's right.
Yeah.
I need you to come make me do what's right, and all I have is the desire, is enough of a desire for that, to say that I would like you to make me do it. So this really is just a very concise, succinct, and powerful, poem to speak to the depth of that, of the recognition of that brokenness, and of our own incapability to not only save ourselves, but even not be, even not betray is the thing, like, right. The recognition of our own incapability to do the right thing in any capacity, even to just not betray and go the wrong way, without the direct interaction of God.
Yeah, this feels to me like a Donne who has been spending some time reading Paul, reading Romans and First Corinthians, reading that which I do not want to do is what I do, that which I want to do I do not do. That the Spirit intercedes for us with groanings when our mouths, when our hearts can't form the words. This is Donne on those kind of big ideas of the struggle between the fallenness, the brokenness of our flesh, and the fact that we are redeemed by God, that we know where we're called and what we're called to, but that infinite qualitative distinction, that inability to achieve what's been planted in us without God saving us, without God's assistance. Yeah, that's an expression of humility. That's walking humbly with God. Is I can't do it.
Well, and the reason that I love to think about this, and had never done this before you called me into this conversation, so thank you for doing that, but thinking about this in connection with Propaganda's poem, with Precious Puritans, is a balancing act, that a writing, a balancing that I did not know, hadn't been able to put into words, was needed, because I love this poem. I love it so much, and it speaks to a very deep and resonant truth. I think there are different people and different times when this sort of mentality can be destructive.
Yeah.
And there are certain people who need it more, and there are certain times when all of heartfelt. We need to be called into a recognition of our own, full brokenness. But then there's the other side of humility. Like, I think if you only stay in this concept of humility, it ends up being destructive because it's so self-deprecating. It's so, I am, incapable, and it can stray into I'm worthless. But that is just as much untrue and an untrue reflection of humility as the other side of like, I'm the best.
Right.
And often I think when we think of humility, we see it in this way, and that can trip into a negative on the other side, whereas propaganda pulls to the other side. He spends 3/4 of his poem calling others out,
right,
and saying you're wrong, and more powerfully than that. I think I would put away that side if I could. Maybe you can edit it out, but he calls to saying the people that I trust and that I look up to and that I quote, they are just as much this brokenness as I am.
Right.
And I am just as much a child of God used for goodness as anyone that I look up to. Like, holding all of that in concert is so difficult and so beautifully done. And I think that you have to have that other side of humility, recognizing the value in yourself and in others, while also holding the brokenness. If you only hold the brokenness, you either begin to despair, or you roll into that false sense of humility that we talked about. And I think that this is such a beautiful pair of poems to hold both sides of that, and to say we need both of these at different times. We need this depth of the recognition of brokenness, and we need this, calling for humility from others, and demanding a true recognition of the same brokenness from our idols and the people that we would otherwise place on a higher plane and on a higher level than ourselves, when really we have all equally fallen to this level of brokenness and all equally need God's grace to step in to save us and salvage us from that. So holding both of these poems in concert together, I think, is just a super powerful thing that I would never have done if not for you. So thank you for that.
Well, and I think you're really smart to pull on the idea that these are not eternal, these are not contextless, these are not forever, these can't be heard at all. And Prop talks about that in his poem, in expressing that it can be hard to hear the Puritans. It can be hard to hear someone who has good doctrine, good theology, knowing that they were slavers, that they were slave holders, because it betrays the theology that they express. And he is absolutely right to say, you know what, it is hard to be a black man and hear that theology expressed, because I know what's going on behind it. I know the truth about it. And the Donne poem is not gentle. And that last line of it, but you ravish me, I never be chaste. That is Elizabethan prettiness for saying rape, right? Yeah. Ravish is talking about rape there. Mm-hmm. He is using some very forceful language that can be very difficult to hear. And I would imagine that not everybody can hear it well, especially not knowing that he spent his youth as a Lothario and a seducer. And that can make that kind of language really, really hard to hear. And that idea that God needs to conquer us in that way is a challenging and difficult one. So these ideas, these poems, they don't exist forever. They don't exist for everyone. The Puritans can't exist for everyone. And it is humility to recognize that. And it is humility for those who, on Prop's part, on our part, as we hear it, and it's humility on the part of those who would quote them, who would cite them, who would read them, who would look up to them, to know these need to be held in proper context and know that they are not eternal. And knowing how they embodied their theology matters, as it does for all of us. Absolutely. I hope that we can find grace only because I hope that I am given grace for all of the
Amen.
things
Come on.
that I am so deeply wrong about, that I'm either in denial about or unaware of. And I assume those are in equal parts. But I want to thank you so much for bringing these poems to us, for helping us to talk about them, for helping us to explore them. I'm going to throw into the notes for all of this, all of the places and ways that people can find Propaganda and John Donne and you. And I am going to, while we're here on camera, try to coerce you into promising that you'll come back and do this again with us sometime.
I would absolutely adore that opportunity.
Yay!
Like I said, it's been a pleasure to talk with you, and it's just been a wonderful blessing to be kind of forced into, not that you have to force me to read poetry, but it did make me like look at poetry and these poems in particular in a brand new way, and that's always fantastic. So thank you for that.
Students, stay put. I will show you your code to scan out, and look for your email next week, where you will move on over to the next group, and we'll keep talking about Micah 6:8 until Thanksgiving. So thanks for being with us, students.